In 1975, a Houston lawyer takes a job with President Gerald Ford, and politics in America is about to change.
He really understood power.
He's got politics in his fingertips.
Jim Baker was one of the great political tacticians.
5 years later, Ronald Reagan names him White House Chief of Staff.
Jim Baker very skillfully began accumulating power, like a pickpocket.
Is he a moderate? Is he a conservative?
He's named Treasury Secretary as a massive financial crisis is brewing.
Keeping this under wraps cost American taxpayers $100 billion.
Even while he proves that a divided government can find solutions.
That's really part of the beauty of this story, is how Jim Baker managed to work with the Democrats.
President Bush makes him Secretary of State.
You think of Baker, the power player, but this other business of negotiating, that's an interesting set of skills.
At a critical moment in history.
He had to make sure that the end of the Cold War didn't lead to things falling apart.
He was ready to take a chance. He was on a high wire, and you don't see that often.
In a time before compromise was a dirty word, when political parties worked together, he was a master of negotiation, always able to find common ground.
It was an eye-opener to me how courageous he was politically.
Where are the Jim Bakers today? Where are the people who know how to cut deals when the deal needs to be cut?
I learned from Jim how to put your cards on the table, but only as many as you really have to put on the table.
Major funding for this program was provided by the Burnett Foundation and the Fondren Foundation, with additional funding provided by the following.
When he left public service after 14 years in Washington, James Baker was out of politics, but he was not out of power.
Stand by. CNN right now is moving our earlier declaration of Florida. This no longer is a victory for Vice President Gore.
It's been a night of giving it to Al Gore, then taking it away on the private networks.
This was a period without precedent in American history. There was an election, and then we didn't know who won.
I don't know whether Governor Bush or I will prevail.
Al Gore had made an announcement that he was going to ask Warren Christopher, former Secretary of State, to represent him in Florida. Governor Bush said, well, we got our own former Secretary of State.
We have asked former United States Secretary of State, James Baker.
He called, and by 2:30 in the afternoon, I was on an airplane on my way to Florida.
It was a return to duty for him, and I think he did it as much for Herbert Walker Bush as he did for George W.
In 1992, Baker headed the re-election campaign for his friend, President George H.W. Bush, and lost.
I always like to think that his real motivation was that we didn't succeed in '92 and we'll succeed now.
It was sort of the perfect culmination of so many aspects of his career. The very successful lawyer, the political operative, the Bush loyalist.
I remember right when we all got there, sitting in this old house we're all working out of, the whole thing was thrown together, of Baker basically saying, fellas, we better have a route to the Supreme Court.
I think from day one he knew that, and so the strategy employed was with that telescopic view of the gain would be there, now how do we position ourselves all the way through?
First, we regard the action of the Secretary.
Warren Christopher regarded this as a narrow dispute to be settled among gentlemen in the courts. Baker said, no, 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 it's going to be in the media, it's going to be in the streets. Jim Baker saw this was a brawl.
We had all those young Republican congressional aides storming the courthouse in Miami trying to stop the recount as if they were the aggrieved party.
If Jim Baker had wanted those protests to stop, they would have stopped the next day. He didn't want them to stop.
They started all that stuff with demonstrations and stuff with Jesse Jackson coming in and others. And so we thought, well, you know, two can play that game.
He stage managed it in a way that just trumped what the Gore campaign could do.
The Democrats were playing checkers and James Baker was playing chess.
The Gore campaign made a fundamental mistake by asking for recounts in 4 solidly Democratic counties and not asking for a statewide recount. That gave us the moral high ground. We could say, wait a minute, we're just going to count in the 4 counties that were overwhelmingly Democratic.
Baker understood in a complex controversy, simplicity mattered. And the simple message had to be, the election is over and Bush won.
We have had counts.
And everything else was just...
We have had multiple counts.
Al Gore being a sore loser.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is time to bring this to a close.
Finally, 1 month after the election, the Bush team appeals a Florida ruling to the U.S. Supreme Court.
It appears that the election...
The case has landed where Baker saw it would from day one.
...is finally over.
3 days later, in a controversial decision, the U.S. Supreme Court overrules the Florida court and declares the time for recounts has run out.
Good morning. Finally, a president-elect. George W. Bush will become the 43rd president of the United States. Congratulations.
I do think it tarnishes his image for some people because it was handled through rough legal tactics rather than a genuine recount to find out what happened. And Baker was one of the people that made sure it went in this direction.
I was there on the inaugural platform. I was sitting on the aisle right there. And on his way out, President Clinton leaned over to me and he said, "You were good there in Florida, real good."
So he had a strong hand going in, but he played it very well. And like I said, I hated it, but he whipped us, but he was good at it.
It's the 3rd time James Baker has helped win the White House. Not bad for someone who was told from an early age, stay out of politics.
Captain Baker, my grandfather, had 11 grandchildren, but I was the only one to have the name, and it was quite special to be James A. Baker.
Jimmy Baker was born into privilege and power. His grandfather, Captain James Addison Baker, was a prominent attorney with a national reputation, central to the founding of Rice University and the building of Houston, Texas.
I used to hear all the time from my mother, particularly, and my father as well, "Jimmy, you've got a real legacy to live up to." That was pounded into me, and fortunately not overly so, or I might not have been able to absorb it.
Young Jimmy writes his own personal code of conduct.
I don't want to stand with the setting sun and hate myself for things I've done. I want to go with my head erect. I want to deserve all men's respect.
Following a family tradition, Baker goes to a Pennsylvania prep school, then to Princeton University. He majors in history and meets the woman who will become his wife, Mary Stuart McHenry.
Mary Stuart and I met when I came up from Houston with the group of girls to Princeton, and we immediately hit it off. We became very good friends, and it was obvious that she and Jimmy were very fond of each other.
After a stint in the Marines and law school, Jim Baker does what 3 generations of Baker men had done before him. He becomes a Houston lawyer with no interest in politics.
I was led to believe that politics was a sort of a scuzzy business that really fine lawyers would not involve themselves in, and that comes from Captain Baker's advice to the young lawyers coming to work at Baker Botts. He said, if you want to be a good lawyer, work hard, study, and stay out of politics.
As a young corporate attorney in a city booming with the oil and gas industry, Baker negotiates a wide variety of business agreements. It's deal-making 101.
He learned a lot about how you figure out who you're going to be dealing with, what their hot buttons are, what their hopes are, who they listen to, who they dislike.
I think negotiating skills are people skills. I think a lot of it is people-to-people stuff.
With their growing family, Jim Baker and Mary Stuart lead a busy life. They become friends with another couple, an oil man named George Bush and his wife, Barbara.
Jimmy Baker and I have been friends for a long, long time. We go back 36, 37 years, I think, around 1960 or so.
Our husbands played tennis together. A lot of tennis together, and they're very proud of the fact that they won the tournament one year.
Well, here's a man with a terribly weak serve in tennis, and it hasn't set him back in life.
They have a similar sense of humor. They're both the last of a breed, really, of men who were sons of very powerful fathers, wonderfully educated, believed in athletics, not just as a way to pass the time, but to build character.
All they did was just laugh. They just laughed the whole time, and I thought, they're really having a wonderful time together.
I think Jimmy was a Democrat, tell you the honest truth, and Mary Stuart was a Republican. And she voted, but he didn't vote usually in the olden days because that was the day the hunting season opened.
I really was pretty much apolitical.
Then, in 1968, 14 years into their marriage, everything would change.
Mary Stuart was the first of our friends to have cancer, and there was not very much to be done about it. It was heartbreaking.
She really was very, very brave about it. She had inflammatory breast cancer, so from the time she was diagnosed till the time she died was only 15 and a half months.
He was so close to Mary Stuart, and she was such a wonderful person, and it was a particularly hard time for him. And he had, it was a hard time for the boys.
They were 15, 13, 8, and 7, so they were pretty young. If I was ever going to become an alcoholic, that's when it would have happened. Because I would go to work, and then I would come home at night, and those 4 little boys would be there, and I'd do what I could to get them to do their homework and get in bed, and then I'd go drown my sorrows in a couple of stiff drinks, or more than a couple. And I'm just really lucky I didn't totally twist off. I came close. My tennis doubles partner and good friend George Bush called me, and he said, you know, Bake, he said, you gotta do something to take your mind off your grief. how about helping me run for the Senate here in Texas? It was so typical George Bush. Here was a friend in trouble, a friend who was suffering. And he asked me to do that. I didn't know a damn thing about politics.
George Bush loses that Senate campaign, but Jim Baker gets his first taste of politics, and he likes it. A group of friends steps in to help with the boys. Among them is Susan Winston, a longtime friend of Mary Stuart's, who is divorced with 3 children.
He met Susan, and it was just like this huge change came over him, and Jimmy was back. It was like we had Jimmy back.
They date for a year and a half, then decide to marry.
We made a horrible mistake. We didn't tell our kids we were going to surprise them. It was going to be a happy surprise. Well, it turned out to be a real bust.
His kids had loved me, my kids had loved him. But when we told him that, it was such a shock. It took a period of adjustment for everybody.
Two years later, Jim Baker has grown restless with being a lawyer, and he's seeking a new challenge. His friend, George Bush, recommends him for a job with President Gerald Ford, and Baker is introduced to the ways of Washington.
When I first met Jim, he was the new Deputy Secretary of Commerce. When I really got to know him, when we really began to work together, was shortly after that, in the course of the 1976 campaign.
Early in the campaign, Baker makes a serious mistake. At a Ford fundraiser in Oklahoma City, he quips to the gathered Republican donors what he thinks they want to hear: that President Ford plans to dump the insufficiently conservative Henry Kissinger as his Secretary of State.
It turns out there was a freelancer there for the Daily Oklahoman, the college paper, and she heard me say this, and she printed it.
Before he knows it, the story is picked up by the national press. 40 years later, it still leaves a sting.
Now, you probably remember when I announced your resignation from the Ford administration.
Yes, and then you told me you had been quoted out of context.
That's right. Well, that's right. Well, that was the only thing I could say. I was totally at a loss for words because I figured that was the absolute end of my public service career. But you were kind enough to let me up after 2 hours of verbal abuse.
By the summer of 1976, President Ford is facing a tough challenge for the Republican nomination. Former California Governor Ronald Reagan is leading a conservative attack, charging that Ford is too moderate. The contest is so close that it will be settled by a delegate count on the floor of the Republican convention. Jim Baker gets the difficult job of keeping delegates committed to President Ford.
It was nuts and bolts. It was the grunge stuff that people a lot of times don't like to do.
On the night of the vote, Baker's delegate operation puts Ford over the top.
20 votes for Gerald R. Ford.
Baker's success earns him a new nickname, and President Ford gives him a new job. He'll lead the campaign against the Democratic challenger, Jimmy Carter.
The head of the PFC will be Jim Baker.
After less than 2 years in Washington, Jim Baker is becoming an insider. It's a close vote, but on election night, President Ford loses to Jimmy Carter. Disappointed, and with no place for him in Washington, Baker goes home to Houston. But now, he's got the political bug.
I thought, well, you know, maybe I ought to try my hand at this politics stuff.
I was proud of him for wanting to run. I knew he would be great.
In Baker's bid for Texas Attorney General, Susan hits the campaign trail with her new baby, Mary Bonner.
one hot summer day up in Lubbock. I saw some people at a shopping center, and I went over to give them some campaign literature. I stick out my hand to introduce myself to this guy, and before I can say a word, he says, "Say, anybody ever tell you you look like Jim Baker?" And I said, "Well, yes, often." This guy never batted an eyelash. She said, "Doesn't it piss you off?" Well, that was the first clue I had I might not win that race for Attorney General.
Baker loses. It's his first and last time as a candidate.
The minute we got the results, Susan and I went to Florida.
Just a long weekend, but we were both cross-eyed. We were so tired.
And before we got back from Florida, George was on the phone saying, "Let's get cracking."
His friend, George Bush, is planning to run for president in 1980, and he wants Jim Baker to lead the campaign.
Jimmy said, "Hi, Bushy." And I thought, oh, blank, blank, blank.
And then I was, in effect, saying, yeah, we got to get going because we start way behind.
It won't be easy. Although he's got an impressive government resume,
Ladies and gentlemen,
Bush is not well known.
I am a candidate for President of the United States.
We started out as an asterisk in the poll. Everybody, when I signed on with George Bush, said, "What are you doing?"
To raise Bush's profile, Baker pours resources into an early state caucus and pulls off a surprise win.
Iowa has sent something in motion. The forward momentum is clearly established, and I am absolutely convinced I will be your next president. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.
Once again, the opponent is Ronald Reagan, considered the frontrunner among the Republicans. It doesn't take long for the rivalry between Bush and Reagan to get personal. Reagan's conservative loyalists accuse Bush of being dangerously moderate. Bush attacks Reagan's policy positions and mocks his tax cut proposals as voodoo economics.
In my judgment, that economic program would exacerbate the deficit. It would
By June, the Bush campaign has fallen behind and money is running out.
I'm not unrealistic, but we got a long way to go.
Although Bush is reluctant to throw in the towel, Baker is planning ahead for when Reagan will pick his running mate. He knows that if Bush continues to fight into Reagan's home state of California, a future alliance between the two men would be all but impossible. So Baker makes a strategic decision.
On his own, he announces that the Bush campaign's out of money, just on the eve of the California primary. Well, that took the wind out of George Bush's sails. George Bush was not happy.
George Bush was grateful in the long run, but it was a difficult time for both of them.
As the Republican convention gets underway, Baker's plan to get Bush on the ticket looks unlikely to succeed.
I flew to the convention with the Reagans. He spent about 15 minutes dumping all over George Bush. He was still mad at him about voodoo economics. And then he says to me, "What do you think I should do in the VP selection?" I says, "That's easy. You're going to pick George Bush." He says, "Weren't you listening to me?" I said, "I listened to you, but you're a pragmatic guy, and George Bush fits the profile."
But the bad feelings run deep. The Reagan campaign is looking for anybody but Bush, even considering former President Gerald Ford as a running mate.
We wanted to go home. We were sort of packing up.
Eventually, Reagan realizes sharing power with a former president would be unworkable.
At that point, I knew where it was going. I went downstairs for something, and I saw Baker sitting in the coffee shop with his bags. I said, "Where are you going?" He said, "I'm going back to Texas." I said, "If I were you, I wouldn't leave."
So we're sitting there in Bush's hotel room, Barbara and me and one or two others. Phone rings. Is Ambassador Bush there for Governor Reagan? And I said, yes, just a minute.
I heard Jimmy say to the three of us were in the room, say yes.
And George comes over and he takes the phone. Hello? Yes, sir, how are you?
With Jimmy at his side saying, say yes, say yes.
And he said, yes, I can.
George assured the president that he would be on his agenda, not George's agenda.
Then he goes like this to us. And it was all we could do not to break out into cheers.
With a deep sense of commitment, I accept your nomination. I accept.
In November, Reagan easily defeats President Jimmy Carter, and the Reagan Revolution begins. The new president's mantra is a triple promise of smaller government, lower taxes, and increased military spending. But the Reagans know that to get their ambitious agenda through Congress, they'll need someone who knows the ways of Washington as their chief of staff.
Reagan's a movie star. A lot of the people around Reagan used to say, give him direction, write the right script, and he'll play it beautifully. But he himself knows that he needs a great director.
Baker's name is raised.
The key to that, of course, is Stu Spencer.
I said, you don't really know him, so what we're going to do is I'm going to put him on the plane, just so you two can talk.
The job offer seems improbable. Not only is Baker considered less conservative than Reagan, he's led 2 campaigns against him.
Reagan had seen Baker on the other side, fighting against him, very organized, very disciplined. And that's one way of checking. You check your foe and you say, well, I'd rather have that guy inside the tent.
He said, Jim, I'd like to talk to you before you go back to Texas. I remember going home and telling Susan, and she started crying.
I just said, oh, honey, I can't do this. I just can't do it. We'd been married only 7 years, but it felt like centuries because of all the machinations of putting the family together, moving to Washington, coming back, going back to Washington, coming back, and juggling all these things with teenagers who are doing all kinds of things they shouldn't have been doing, and this toddler, this 3-year-old. I just thought, I can't do this. But in the morning, I was thinking, well, God has been so good. He's gotten me through all this. I guess he'll get me through the next phase.
A few days after the election, Jim Baker goes to his first meeting at President-elect Reagan's Los Angeles home.
I walk up the driveway and I look in the window and I thought to myself, what are you doing here? I guess the president-elect saw me out there and he got up and came to the door. He said, Jim, what are you doing out there? Come on in. I went in and sat down with all these people that I'd been campaigning against for so long. And it was really a little bit of an eerie feeling.
Baker's appointment is a surprise to many, including longtime Reagan insider Edwin Meese. The conservative Meese expects to be named White House Chief of Staff. When Reagan names Baker instead, he asks him to share the job somehow with Meese. It falls to Baker to smooth over the hurt feelings.
Ed and I went down to a coffee shop in the Century Plaza, and we started talking about how we might be able to cooperate and divide up the responsibilities. And I said, well, let me tell you, I think it would be appropriate if you had cabinet rank, and I didn't. That was part of the way I thought we might make this work.
So he said, you're the broad policy guy, I'm the practical politics guy. Well, it's the practical politics guy in Washington who winds up by running things, but Meese didn't know that.
And we drew a little memo, a little one-page memo, And we outlined our respective duties and responsibilities.
He had Meese on one side and Baker on the other, and then they went down and itemized who was going to do what the duties and responsibilities were.
And I remember in one place, Ed had put down that he would attend any meetings that the president attended, so I put on my side to attend any meetings that the president attended.
And each man, he had initialed it, and each man dated it. And there actually were times, not many, where that letter came back out.
And what Jim had done was very perceptive because he had his hands on the levers of all the controls that really run the place.
It doesn't take long for the ideological differences to surface.
The real conservatives, the Reaganites, began to see Jim Baker as the enemy and targeted him.
The most negative charge you could make about anybody around Reagan was to say they were moderate, they were pragmatists.
I was more moderate than Ed Meese, but when press characterized me that way, that created problems for me internally.
He was in a difficult situation, so he recruited a very powerful ally who had an inside track to the Reagans, and that was Mike Deaver.
PR man Michael Deaver is practically a member of the Reagan family. He is especially close to the First Lady. Baker, Ed Meese, and Mike Deaver become the threesome that controls the White House agenda.
Meese has policy, Baker has politics, Deaver has the body, the president's body, which means he's the last guy who talks to the president. If you're going to be the chief of staff, you always want to make sure that you or your guy has the last word with the president. That's what the president hears, and particularly with a president like Reagan, who is enormously dependent on staff.
On Capitol Hill, Reagan's conservative agenda enjoys support from the Republican Senate. But the Democratic House of Representatives is a different story. And it is Baker's job to come up with a winning strategy.
Baker would usually put things into three categories: the things that are easy to do, the things that are impossible to do, and the things that you might get done but are really hard. And what he always did was said, let's forget the impossible. We'll leave the easy to, the agencies and other people. We're going to focus on hard but doable.
Personalities play a big role in it. Sometimes it's just horse trading. Sometimes a representative wants to trade his vote for something for his district or his state. Well, you do that.
Jim was a master of never letting a phone call from a congressman go unreturned. Every single day he'd return every one of them. And also very, very effective as a spokesman with the press.
Interestingly, a lot of what Jim Baker accomplished and forced through were compromises. And yet people didn't think that Reagan compromised. It was brilliant.
Reagan's successes mount up. And Baker is becoming one of the most powerful White House chiefs of staff in history.
It's not that you're trying to acquire power for power's sake. Power really accretes to those who get things done.
But the tension inside the White House is taking a toll on Baker. In 1983, when the National Security Advisor announces his resignation, Baker makes a try for the job. He and Deaver propose the idea to Reagan, who gives his approval.
Then Deaver and Baker did something that is unbelievable for as clever as they were. They set up the thing, Reagan went along with it, and then Reagan had a meeting with a National Security Council planning staff, and Baker and Deaver did not attend. And who's sitting in there? The conservatives who were against Baker and Deaver, and in that meeting they talked Reagan out of the plan.
There was a revolt on the part of some of the more ideological members of the administration, and the president changed his mind.
So Baker stumbled because he failed to follow his own rules, which is always have the last word with the president.
The following year, 1984, Ronald Reagan wins re-election in a landslide.
I think that's just been arranged.
Baker returns to his White House office, exhausted, not just from the campaign, but from 4 years of White House infighting.
He was so tired at the end of his 4th year. I don't think he smiled. He was so anxious to get out of it that he even considered being baseball commissioner.
A few weeks after the election, Jim Baker is visiting the office of Treasury Secretary Donald Regan. Out of the blue, Regan makes a radical suggestion.
And he said, well, you know something? He said, we ought to switch jobs. I said, don't say that twice, Don, because I sure as hell might take you up on it if the president was willing to have it happen.
Being in the cabinet changed his image in Washington. People now understood that Jim Baker was not just a political practitioner, a guy who made the train run on time, but he was a guy who could actually preside over an arena of policy. And that's a big change. It's a big jump.
At the top of the Treasury priority list is a Reagan campaign promise to reform the U.S. tax code, a notorious political minefield.
The problem that Ronald Reagan had was that he had pushed through these big tax cuts in 1981. They wanted to cut taxes again, but couldn't do it because they couldn't afford that. Tax reform gave President Reagan a way to do that. You could cut tax rates, but make up the revenue by closing loopholes.
Day one, get there. We're not even confirmed in the positions, and Baker is convening every Saturday.
Whenever he worked in government on weekends, it was assumed it was casual. So blue jeans, in his case, cowboy boots. At the time, he chewed tobacco. So he had a plastic coffee cup, a white styrofoam cup, that he would spit in. It was the most attractive habit.
And Jim Baker would do what he did best, which was discuss the political implications of the very wide-ranging tax breaks that they meticulously went through, deciding which ones would go and which ones would stay.
Every special interest tax break is on the table, but Baker is protective of the oil and gas industry.
Baker was a Texas oil man. He wasn't going to let down the folks back home.
The Democrat across the table from him is the tough chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, Dan Rostenkowski.
Baker was pragmatic enough to know that you had to work with a Democrat like Danny Rostenkowski, who knew where every comma and paragraph and subparagraph in the tax code was.
Baker negotiates with Rostenkowski for months to craft a plan that will satisfy both parties. Eventually, the hard-nosed Democrat agrees to help sell the Republican administration's tax reform package.
I mean, that's really part of the beauty of this story, is how Jim Baker managed to work with the other party in order to keep this thing moving.
In December 1985, Baker and Rostenkowski are ready to bring their tax bill to the House for a vote, but they run into trouble. Some Republican congressmen, including Dick Cheney, think Baker has given away too much to the Democrats.
I got together with some of my colleagues, Trent Lott from Mississippi, for example, and we organized an effort and we killed the rule under which the bill was to be debated, which meant it was dead. It couldn't be brought up on the floor.
I never will forget Dick Cheney and Trent Lott, maybe a couple of others coming down to my office at the Treasury Department, said, we're going to beat you on this.
We thought we'd won a major victory. Then Jim went to work.
I ended up talking directly to the president and saying, you know, you really need to do this, Mr. President. If you don't tell House Republicans to vote for this, your number one domestic priority for your second term is dead. It's a big political defeat for you.
He got Ronald Reagan to come up and address all of the House Republicans gathered in one of the big caucus rooms there in Rayburn.
I'm asking for your help to secure this real and acceptable tax reform.
Reagan looked at the crowd and he said, "Now, gentlemen, about that tax bill." That's all he had to say.
I'm asking you this because I believe, and believe it as deeply as my heart can believe, that our train is bound for glory.
People started jumping up saying, "I'm with you, Mr. President. You can count on me, Mr. President." They took the rule back to the floor that day and switched 70 votes, passed it.
After more than a year of negotiations, the compromise tax reform bill is signed into law.
Republicans got lower tax rates, which they felt was critical to continuing economic growth, and Democrats and liberals got a fairer tax system.
It was the Baker trait of finding a way to make things happen that allowed tax reform to go from impossible to inevitable.
It's the sort of thing you almost never see happen today.
But behind the scenes, Baker knows his Treasury Department is facing a huge challenge. Early in Reagan's first term, the president deregulated the savings and loan industry. It proves to be an expensive mistake. By 1985, when Baker takes over at Treasury, the banks are facing large losses from bad investments. And tens of thousands of depositors will lose their savings if the federal government doesn't step in.
There was suddenly a $30 to $50 billion savings and loan crisis. So you had to come up with that much money to pay off depositors because there was federal deposit insurance, and these banks had become insolvent. So to make good on that promise, you were going to have a bailout.
But after a pledge of smaller government and lower taxes, the Reagan administration doesn't want to spend the money.
Today I find out that we have something to worry about, and they do not guarantee our money back.
From James Baker's point of view, I'm sure it was, do we bite the bullet and say we're going to have this bailout and be honest with the American public? Or do we keep it under wraps a little bit, pray that it somehow morphs into a solution, and but possibly run the risk of having it grow into a bigger problem? And they chose the latter course.
As the 1988 election draws near, Reagan's team continues to downplay the severity of the issue.
They made a decision that keeping this under wraps was worth doing for these other things they wanted to achieve, namely being in power for an additional presidency.
Resources must be devoted to cleaning up this problem.
By the time a new president finally tackles the crisis in 1989, what started as a $50 billion bailout will cost the taxpayers more than $150 billion.
The biggest single reason the tab is as big as it is today is because of delay by the federal government in coming to grips with a problem that blew up on us 10 years ago.
But virtually no one in government, including Baker's Treasury Department, gets the blame.
I think part of the reason that Baker escapes and Treasury escapes during this period is that this was not something that either party really wanted to go after. Democrats, the Speaker of the House, Jim Wright, was very vulnerable on this issue because Republicans were attacking him for having protected the Texas savings and loans.
What we have done has been done in the public interest.
And many Republicans, John McCain and others, were also implicated.
Keeping this under wraps cost American taxpayers hundreds of billions of dollars. And the bailout still has not been paid off entirely. It really is a legacy of the presidents that he served, but Baker was the point person for them, and this certainly has to go into the history books for what he did or didn't do.
Thank you all very, very much.
When George Bush runs for president to succeed Ronald Reagan, there is no question about who will head up his campaign.
It was not something I was enamored with doing. I mean, I enjoyed being the Treasury Secretary. But there was never any doubt in my mind that I was going to do it.
Baker has led 2 previous campaigns for his friend and lost both. This time, he's determined to get it right.
Let's go over the top tomorrow for Michael Dukakis.
Bush's opponent is Governor Michael Dukakis of Massachusetts, who starts out with a significant lead.
Thank you all very much.
The Bush team's strategy is to portray Dukakis as an out-of-touch liberal, soft on defense and crime.
Bush supports the death penalty for first-degree murderers.
A political action committee runs a controversial ad claiming that Dukakis will release dangerous criminals.
One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery, stabbing him 19 times.
It may be the greatest measure that they thought they were in trouble, that they did play the race card.
Dukakis on crime.
What happened this week when Mr. Bush said he was going to turn positive, and then the very next day he was out on his own negative?
I think it's a definitional problem. Turning positive doesn't mean that you're not.
I interviewed him on Face the Nation about that ad, and boy, his back went up. I'm not sure the public would have seen the anger, because he had a great way of smoothing it over. You did see him toughen up with me.
Congressman Dick Gephardt, who himself ran for President of the United States and is one of the major surrogates of the Democratic ticket, said the other day about our campaign, Adolf Hitler would love these people. Now that's an outrageous statement.
Politics ain't beanbag. Politics is a blood sport. I damn well know that because I've done a lot of it and I have the bruises to show for it.
Political commentators condemn the tone of the campaign.
The '88 campaign was so different from the 1980 primary race. One wondered whether the 2 men had decided to remake Bush, or whether Bush himself had fundamentally changed in 8 years, or whether the 2 men had learned from Ronald Reagan how you could win in a more conservative America.
Dukakis is ineffective in getting his message across. On election night, Bush wins an overwhelming majority of the electoral votes and a healthy 7% margin in the popular vote.
I want to thank my great friend, Houston's son, Jim Baker, and
It's hard to imagine that there would be a President George H.W. Bush if there hadn't been a Jim Baker.
It was quite an emotional experience. I had a lot of pride in the fact that we won it.
There's just, the weight of it is so great that everybody feels it, and the closest friends, and nobody called him George anymore. We all called him Mr. President.
For Jim Baker, it is the moment he's been waiting for. President Bush has appointed him Secretary of State. He can put campaigning aside and bring his political talents to the world stage.
The international game is politics writ large. If you're a superb at domestic politics, as Jim Baker was, you're playing two-dimensional chess. When you move to foreign policy, you're playing three-dimensional chess.
Baker assembles a close team of advisors.
Jim Baker knew how to bring really great people around him. He had some awfully good people like Bob Zoellick and Dennis Ross, Margaret Tutwiler.
You could have the most strenuous argument you have ever had, adult to adult. And once he had listened, processed it all, and he'd made the decision, you either got on the train or you could leave. And it worked, and nobody ever left.
Baker is taking his post at a critical moment in the 40-year history of the Cold War. But he does have an advantage that few American secretaries of state have enjoyed.
The birthday boy. I'd like to record this. This is the 59th birthday of our Secretary of State. We're very proud.
How do you describe friendship? How do you describe trust? How do you describe respect? And all of these characteristics really embody our personal relationship.
A Secretary of State who is close to the president and can count on the president's backing and really represent the president is well ahead of the game.
The operation of foreign policy can become so concentrated in the White House that people aren't sure when the Secretary of State says, let's have a peace conference in Madrid, for example, that the president means it. They didn't have any doubt about that with Baker.
By 1989, Mikhail Gorbachev, the dynamic General Secretary of the Soviet Union, is deep into his campaign to reform communism. He seems eager to reach out to the new U.S. administration. Baker and Bush are cautious, but open to moving ahead.
When Bush and Baker decided that they could do business with Gorbachev, it wasn't entirely without criticism, which came from Dick Cheney, the Secretary of Defense, Dan Quayle, the Vice President, and probably some of the neoconservatives who would prove to be a lot more important later on.
The key for Baker is going to be his relationship with his Soviet counterpart, Foreign Minister Edward Shevardnadze. In the late summer of 1989, the two men are scheduled for a formal meeting in Washington. Baker has a different idea.
What he had in mind was to get out of Washington, create an air of informality, to be able to do business in a very different kind of setting.
At the time, they had a silly rule that Soviet diplomats could not go 25 miles from the United Nations or 25 miles from Washington, D.C. So we put them on our planes, and we say, well, we're going to go a whole lot further than 25 miles, and we're going to Jackson Hole, Wyoming.
I was actually the pool reporter on the flight and got to sit there because it was a very small plane. And 2 seats away, while Baker and Shevardnadze were deep in conversation.
Baker was asking Shevardnadze about his hopes and his fears. It wasn't that it was personal in terms of, I want to know about your background. It was personal in terms of, what are you hoping to do for your country? What are the things that worry you?
I knew that I was watching something really historic.
That plane flight and that conversation had a profound effect, I think, on Secretary Baker in terms of, this is a guy who we want to help succeed.
As an old song goes, this is the place where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and that might account for the positive outcome of our talks today.
Just 2 months later, that relationship is put to the test. East Berlin, the capital of communist East Germany. Cut off for more than 25 years by the 12-foot-high barrier, the Berlin Wall. Then, on November 9, 1989, a day I'll never forget, chaos in the East German leadership, and the wall is open.
What you see behind me is a celebration of this new policy announced today by the East German government that now, for the first time since the wall was erected in 1961, people will be able to move through freely.
East Germans stream to the crossing points by the thousands. Overwhelmed border guards have no orders and let them through. And East Germany finally is open to the West. As the world celebrates, some of his advisors urge President Bush to take a victory lap.
Probably 8 out of 9 secretaries of state would have said to their president, it's a triumph for foreign policy. This is a huge achievement for you. Go to Berlin, give a speech that conveys our excitement that the wall is coming down. Jim Baker didn't do that.
Jim Baker understood that Mikhail Gorbachev was in a very delicate situation.
Make a brief statement here.
I remember being there with him, sitting at the desk as the press crowded around.
I welcome the decision by the East German leadership to open the borders.
There's just wild jubilation going on. And the president's listing in his chair, limp. And he's almost got a scowl on his face. He looks almost sad.
This is a sort of great victory.
And I remember asking, well, you don't seem elated.
Battle, but you don't seem elated. And I'm wondering if you're thinking
I'm
of the
elated.
problem.
I'm just not an emotional kind of guy.
Well, how elated are you?
I'm very pleased. And I've been very pleased with a lot of other developments. And
And the president said, look, we've got a lot of work still to do with the Soviet leaders, and I don't intend to stick it in their eye. And I certainly don't intend to dance on the ruins of the Berlin Wall.
I totally understood why they were doing it, and I applaud it. I think, though, that Bush could have found a way to both send a signal to Gorbachev that we were not going to take advantage of him at that moment, and express the sense of celebration that was going on around the country.
George Bush took the hit domestically in order to help Gorbachev, which made for a much better negotiating partner later.
I believe it's important that the United States of America at that time pursued this particular course of understanding and interaction. President Bush had the kind of prudence, the kind of caution that's so necessary to leaders of countries like ours.
The dramatic changes in Germany present President Bush and Baker with an unexpected opportunity. For 40 years, the divided Germany has been the epicenter of Cold War tensions. Now, with the Berlin Wall open, Baker and Bush see a chance to help reunite the two Germanys and bring back the most populous nation in the heart of Europe.
George Bush sees this as a historic opportunity to settle one of the great issues of international politics of the 20th century.
But the political challenges are daunting. The prospect of this giant new Germany alarms the leaders of Germany's former enemies, Francois Mitterrand of France and Margaret Thatcher of Britain.
She wasn't against German reunification. She couldn't be. Every NATO leader for 30 years had supported the concept of German reunification, but none of them expected it to happen. And when it suddenly burst upon us, she thought we had to move carefully.
I think you're going much too fast, much too fast. You have to take these things step by step and handle them very wisely.
Thatcher was saying things like the Germans are going to achieve in peacetime what they couldn't achieve in wartime.
Francois Mitterrand had that famous statement, I like Germany so much there ought to be two of them. He did it with humor, but I think that's really the way he felt.
So a lot of what President Bush and Secretary Baker had to do was to persuade them, on the one hand, that the Germans could be trusted, and on the other hand, to lean on them and say, well, this is where we're going, and you boys better come along.
An even harder sell is going to be Gorbachev. The Soviet leader is under enormous pressure from conservative hardliners in his own government who don't want to give up their satellite nation. Losing East Germany might just get him ousted.
Gorbachev and Shevardnadze have challenging factions on their own side. The KGB, the Politburo, the military.
Making it even more difficult for the Soviet leader, Baker and Bush are insisting that the reunited Germany would become a member of NATO, the Western Defense Alliance that opposes the Communist Warsaw Pact.
The idea that you could reunify Germany and make it part of the Western Alliance, which would be a fundamental defeat for the Soviet Union, seemed impossible, pushing Gorby to the brink.
So Baker sets out to convince the Soviets to approve German reunification within NATO.
He was meeting Shevardnadze every other week. Every meeting wasn't a meeting that stood on its own. Each meeting was designed to move you closer. Each meeting was designed to achieve something.
Baker's success will depend on whether he can help Gorbachev deal with the hardliners on his own side.
It's so important to understand the political constraints on the person across the table.
We needed to help the Soviets have an explanation for their own public. Part of the story was coming up with points that they could use.
What Secretary Baker told Gorbachev was, it's going to be much better for the Soviet Union if you have a stable Germany. If you have a neutral Germany, it could be like a loose cannonball.
In Baker, you see somebody exquisitely focused on solving the other side's problem in order to solve his own. Baker and Bush really were exemplary at this.
Okay, everybody out this way, please.
By May 1990, when Gorbachev arrives in Washington for a summit meeting, Baker has achieved only part of what he needs.
You tired from jet lag or you got over the jet lag?
Gorbachev has agreed to German reunification, but he has not yet said yes to letting the new Germany join NATO. The White House team has a plan to remind Gorbachev of an old agreement.
The Helsinki Accords basically said that countries should have the right to join whatever alliances that they wish.
Now, this is something that the Soviet Union had signed on to in the 70s when there was no question of where Germany's alliance would be. West Germany in NATO, East Germany in the Warsaw Pact.
Now that Gorbachev is under so much political pressure at home, can the Soviet leader keep to that earlier agreement? As the meeting gets underway, Bush poses the question.
The president said, do you think Germany ought to be able to choose the alliances it wants to be in, a unified Germany?
Gorbachev said, yes, that's right. And I heard it, of course, first in the Russian, and I was startled. I sort of sat up, and I jotted on a piece of paper, the president should ask him again.
And Scowcroft handed me a note over my shoulder like this. He was sitting behind me, Jimmy Baker over here, handed me a note. He said, make him repeat this. So I said, well, Mikhail, let me be clear on this. You know, what you're saying is self-determination. And he repeated it.
Well, that caused consternation in the room, and his partners asked for a recess of the meeting.
We caucused outside afterwards, and we said, how can we nail this down?
See you later.
Later that day, the Americans asked the Soviet delegation whether they can announce Gorbachev's response to the press.
We never heard from them. The next day, the president said it. Gorbachev nodded. We had what we needed on NATO.
That was a major breakthrough and a very important one for world peace, I think.
By summer, Baker's diplomacy has won over the British and the French, and Gorbachev signs the formal agreement to allow German reunification within NATO.
Baker brought about a strategic revolution in the center of Europe without producing an enormous crisis. And that was one of the considerable diplomatic achievements of that period.
But there is no time to celebrate. Within weeks, a new crisis erupts. Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein invades the neighboring country of Kuwait. President Bush and Baker know that the U.S. response to this aggression will set an important precedent.
This was the first conflict after the end of the Cold War, and we want to establish rules.
They felt a huge responsibility to show that as the big superpower, the only superpower, we could get it right. We could do it right.
The international community should draw together.
Baker happens to be in Mongolia when Iraq invades Kuwait.
That it will not tolerate.
He decides to try something unprecedented.
I will be in Moscow this evening, touching down there on my way back to the United States, and I would hope.
For much of the Cold War, Iraq has been a client state of the Soviet Union. Now, Baker is going to ask the Soviets to join the United States against Iraq.
If we could get the foreign minister of the Soviet Union to stand shoulder to shoulder with the American Secretary of State and condemn Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, it was a big deal.
While Baker heads to Moscow, his aides, Robert Zoellick and Dennis Ross, are already trying to convince Edward Shevardnadze to speak out alongside Baker.
We would come up with drafts and Tarasenko would take the Shevardnadze, and it looks like we would have a reasonable draft, but then it'd go back into the Soviet bureaucracy and it'd get all watered down.
Once again, Shevardnadze is under pressure from the Kremlin hardliners.
I said, well, I can't have Baker come for a statement like this. I mean, if this is what's going to happen, I'm going to tell Baker not to come. Now, unfortunately, this was a great thing for me to say, but we had no communications. I couldn't reach him.
When Baker arrives in Moscow, the issue still is not settled.
I tell Baker when he lands, I said, you've got to persuade Shevardnadze now, and you've got to tell him everything you've been working towards is now going to be affected by whether or not he's prepared to do this. And he stops me and says, I know what to say.
It was a fairly contentious meeting. We kicked it around for 90 minutes. And finally, though, he agreed.
The Soviet Union and the United States condemned the brutal and illegal invasion of Kuwait by Iraqi military forces.
For Baker, that moment marks a turning point in history.
When you have the American Secretary of State and the Foreign Minister of the Soviet Union standing together shoulder to shoulder and condemning the actions of a Soviet client state, the Cold War's over.
With the Soviets on board, Baker sets out to build an international coalition that includes Arab nations against one of their own. The key will be to get the support of the United Nations. If he succeeds, it will breathe new life into an institution many thought was obsolete.
At the time, a lot of people were criticizing them. Why are you doing this? You don't need that. The UN's for sissies. But they understood that operating in that part of the world, you needed maximum legitimacy. And they went through a painstaking process to get it.
But almost immediately, Iraq defies sanctions imposed by the UN. Saddam sends oil tankers into the Persian Gulf, trying to provoke the U.S. into military action before the coalition even has been established.
Most of the president's advisors, Secretary Cheney, Brent Scowcroft, Margaret Thatcher, wanted to immediately take out those ships.
This is the moment when Margaret Thatcher, Prime Minister of Great Britain, says, "Don't go wobbly, George." Baker was alone in arguing this would be a disaster.
Baker believes an attack now would rupture his fragile partnership with Shevardnadze and Gorbachev and push the Soviets to veto a future UN resolution allowing the use of force. But he's at a disadvantage. He's 2,500 miles from the center of power.
I was at my cabin in Wyoming. It was summertime. We were on vacation.
From his remote ranch in the Rockies, Baker arranges a phone call with Shevardnadze.
Shevardnadze said, give me 3 days to see if I can't get Saddam to turn those ships around before you take military action to take them out.
Baker's next call is to the president.
He said, look, give me a few more days. Because if you use unilateral American force right now, I can assure you, Gorbachev, for his own political survival, could not support us.
And I was way out there, and they were all right there with him, and I frankly thought I wouldn't win that argument, notwithstanding my close relationship with him, because everybody else was on the other side. But he knew.
The president listened to Jim Baker, and it was the right thing to do.
That was Baker's achievement, and it was very important because it laid the ground for the Soviets to support the United States in the Gulf War.
While President Bush begins a massive buildup of U.S. troops, Baker continues on the diplomatic front, putting together the international coalition committed to expelling Iraq from Kuwait.
And then in due course, he actually went and got everybody to pay for the war. It was the only war we've ever fought that had a good return on investment financially.
But before launching the war, there is one more diplomatic step.
The president told Baker, congratulations, you did a great job, but I got to prove to the American people I went the extra mile.
He wanted to see if there was some way to resolve this without war. And he gave it that one last chance.
That's one of the things that's so striking about both men is they are fundamentally careful and thoughtful. Neither one of them is a cowboy. Neither one of them is erratic. Neither one of them would let ideology drive a decision contrary to fact.
On January 9, 1991, only 1 week before the U.S. imposed deadline to launch the war, Baker meets in Geneva with Iraq's foreign minister, Tariq Aziz.
It was deadly serious. And at the time, sitting beside Minister Tariq Aziz was Saddam Hussein's son-in-law. And it was clear that he was going out and leaving the room and talking to Saddam Hussein and coming back in with instructions.
And I felt like looking at Tariq Aziz, if it had been up to him, he would have looked for a way out.
He kept wanting us to give something to Saddam to save face. And I said, hey, that's not what this is about.
Is it finished, Mr. Baker?
15-minute break.
A couple times in the meeting, Tariq Aziz would hint that something could be possible. Let's just continue these discussions. And Baker said, you want to continue the discussions, commit now to withdraw. It didn't take you long to get in. It shouldn't take you any time to get out.
Tariq Aziz wasn't a fool at all. But yet, for some reason that's hard to process in your mind, they didn't blink.
They met for like 6 hours. And then suddenly they called the press conference. Baker goes up to give his remarks, to give his assessment of the day.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have just given President Bush a full report.
And then I'll never forget, he said, but regrettably, ladies and gentlemen.
Regrettably, ladies and gentlemen.
And I remember my fingers, it was so I couldn't hit the keys because I knew that from that half sentence, but regrettably, ladies and gentlemen, a whole history would now flow. And that was Gulf War I, which unfortunately was the precursor to Gulf War II.
Within 60 days, the U.S.-led coalition has crushed the Iraqi army and sent Saddam Hussein fleeing back to Iraq. With the objective accomplished, Bush orders a halt to hostilities. It is a controversial decision. Many think the U.S. should pursue Saddam all the way to Baghdad and bring down his regime.
People like to say he should have gone to Baghdad, but that was never the mission. The president had no intention of doing that. None of us thought that something we should do. The UN didn't authorize it. Congress didn't authorize it.
We didn't have extended discussions because if we had gone to Baghdad, we would then be occupiers of a hostile system. We hadn't prepared for that. We got a lot of criticism for that for several years, but it all stopped in 2005.
أريد سلامتكم هذا. أيوة. مع السلامة. شكرا. شكرا. أنت أجيب له؟ لا لا. لا شكرا. إذا كنت أنا ما أريد. أيوة. أريد سلامتكم هذا.
The success of the Gulf War coalition has changed the political landscape of the Middle East. Jim Baker wants to seize the moment to pursue one of the most elusive goals in diplomacy, a peace agreement between Israel and its neighbors.
It seemed to me that time was ripe to make a major effort. Brent thought I would be wasting my time, and we talked about it, and finally we went to the president. The president said, well, Brent, if he's willing to do it, don't you think we ought to let him try?
Jim just really believed that it would be possible to get an agreement so that both sides would not be in a state of constant war. And that was his passion.
Baker proposes a partnership with the Soviet Union to sponsor a peace conference, inviting Arabs and Israelis to meet face-to-face for the first time in decades. To get them there, he'll have to negotiate with some of the most difficult leaders in the recent history of the Middle East.
Baker was trying to get a deal between Yitzhak Shamir, Yasser Arafat, and Hafez al-Assad. You have to understand, Hafez hated Yasser, Yasser hated Hafez, Yitzhak hated Yasser, Yasser hated Yitzhak, and I guess Shamir and Hafez, there certainly was no love lost between them.
Further complicating his job, Baker is seen by some as being anti-Israel. Early in his term, he made a controversial speech to a pro-Israel lobbying group.
For Israel, now is the time to lay aside once and for all the unrealistic vision of a greater Israel.
Jim Baker had made a remarkably courageous statement to AIPAC. He had called on Israel to do two things: stop building settlements and prepare in a peace agreement to withdraw from the occupied territories.
Forswear annexation. Stop settlement activity.
He did arouse a firestorm of condemnation.
Reach out to the Palestinians as neighbors who deserve political rights.
You have a lot of American Jews who were very upset with Baker and Bush because they were tough. But at the end of the day, talk to Israelis.
There are people who even said that Baker was an anti-Semite. I didn't buy that. I do think that Baker had no special emotional attitude, either in favor of Israel or against Israel.
He was a friend, but not a friend that all the time, shows up. He didn't feel that if he's a friend, he has to embrace you every 5 minutes.
Baker played hardball with everybody. That's what you got to do. And frankly, he and Bush were the last two, I would argue, American president, Secretary of State, to really play hardball with the Israelis and Palestinians.
One of Baker's first steps is a fence-mending call to the Israeli ambassador in Washington.
I said, Mr. Secretary? He said, don't call me Mr. Secretary, call me Jim. And I'll call you Zalman if that's all right with you. I said, perfectly right. I was flabbergasted. And then the next sentence was even more flabbergasting, if there's a word like that. Zalman, I want to do the peace process with you. Come and see me tomorrow.
I believe he took 15 trips to the Middle East. On 14 of those trips, the lead of my story was the last day. Secretary of State James A. Baker III failed again to put together the peace conference. Secretary of State James A. Baker III failed again. We all delighted in that. That's what we do. But what I really respect about that, and you don't see that much anymore these days, he was ready to fail. And he put himself out there.
One of Baker's toughest problems is to convince Syria's autocratic leader, Hafez al-Assad, to meet with the Israelis.
Assad was a brutal tyrant, and he was hard to deal with because he would lecture you for hours.
One meeting I remember went on for 6 hours and 45 minutes. I had advised Secretary Baker in the beginning that Assad never goes to the men's room. So Baker says, I'm the Secretary of State of the free world. If he doesn't go to the bathroom, I'm not going to go to the bathroom.
I would meet with him over a 2 or 3 day period. He agreed to something one day. I went back the next day, and he started welshing on what he'd agreed to. And in fact, at one point said, well, I didn't agree to that. And I said, oh, really? I said, well, then there's not much point in my staying here. And I went like this, and I folded my folder. If you do that, you better damn well be ready to leave. And I was. Assad quickly backtracked and said, yes, well, that's right. Well, that is what I agreed to.
Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir of Israel is going to be equally tough. His determination to build settlements in occupied territories puts him at odds with all the Arab nations.
Shamir was a hardliner, and he was a proponent of a greater Israel. He wanted to annex, include all of those Arab lands that Israel occupied after the war. But I had an extraordinarily good personal relationship with him.
Baker knows the key is to get the parties signed on in the right order.
Once the Palestinians, the Gulf states, and Assad were on board, Shamir essentially had to say yes.
James Baker did something that nobody else could ever achieve, and that is to bring Prime Minister Shamir to an international conference.
October 1991, Madrid, Spain. Baker's shuttle diplomacy has achieved something many said was impossible. Israelis and Palestinians, along with virtually every other Arab state and the Soviet Union, are sitting at the same table.
It was quite an accomplishment at the time. It was the first time Israel and all of its Arab neighbors had ever sat down face-to-face to negotiate peace. And guess what? We had them all.
This conference has been vital in establishing for all to see that Arab and Israeli leaders can meet and meet face-to-face.
The Palestinians were always terrified of being dumped on by the other Arab states for selling out. The peace conference in Madrid sent a signal that it wouldn't be a sellout. And the Israelis always wanted, as a condition of peace, normal relations with their other Arab neighbors. Their presence in Madrid made it seem that that might be possible.
This has been a start, an historic start that has broken old taboos. It's an important start, one that opens new opportunities, but it is only a start.
The Madrid conference paves the way for secret talks in Oslo. And 2 years later, the Israelis and the Palestinians sign a landmark accord. 3 years into his term as Secretary of State, Jim Baker has had stellar successes and is hoping for more. But President George H.W. Bush loses the 1992 election. And after serving 3 presidents, James Baker leaves public office. As a private citizen, Baker stays involved in foreign affairs. But it's his return to the business world that calls attention to a larger issue. A pattern of former public officials who trade on their influence to make lucrative private deals.
I call it the mercenary culture. Mercenary culture is that space between private and public sector where a lot of former officials, frankly, get rich.
Baker's Middle East connections are valuable to the energy giant Enron. And he joins the Carlyle Group, a high-powered private equity firm that crafts deals around the world.
What government official is going to not take a phone call from former Secretary of State James Baker? There's not a single person in the world that wouldn't take that phone call, including our president.
It can erode trust, and it can create ethical issues in terms of how someone acts. And someone of Baker's stature, there's always the question, they're still seen in some ways as representing the United States. He's so famous, he's so legendary. And in places like the Middle East, as a result of his time as Secretary of State, they know him as a representative of this country.
While that special status may raise concerns, It has also led every president in the years since to call on Baker to solve problems domestic and international.
There are very few men in the history of the United States who have been as good at politics as Jim Baker.
I think he's now regarded as one of the best Secretaries of State we've had in the 20th century.
You can find out more about James Baker and the historic events that took place during his career by visiting pbs.org. Major funding for this program was provided by the Burnett Foundation and the Fondren Foundation, with additional funding provided by the following: